Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Giant Pod with me, Andy Wrintmore. My guest this week is tree specialist Julian Hight. We talk about, you guessed it, trees of all shapes, sizes, nationalities and species. We talk about activism. We talk about protecting ancient forests. We talk about punk rock. We talk about the 3 books that he's written, Britain's Tree Story. We talk about the journey he went on to write World Trees Story, where he went to 39 countries to research this book. And we talk about mythology surrounding trees in certain cultures on his travels and all kinds of different things. Really, really quite an incredible story there. And then we talk about his latest book called Britain's Ancient Forests. He also gives us a little tease that there may be another book in the works, so you have to stick around and listen all the way to the end, really, for that one. I had a really great chat with Julian. I really liked his energy. He really knows his stuff. I'm really grateful for the time that he spent chatting to me. I really learnt a lot. I think you guys will really learn a lot. There's so many interesting facts within this podcast, and you could just tell, listening to him, that he really, truly loves this. And that, for me, is when a podcast is at its best, is when you're speaking to someone who really wants to be here, really loves talking about what they're talking about, and you can just vibe off the energy. And I think you guys will as well listening to this. I hope you do, because the enthusiasm is infectious. And I'm going to stop waffling on now, and we're just going to get straight to it. Here it is, Julian Hight on The Giant Pod. Enjoy. It's a good chat, I think we're going to have. I really enjoyed Jake. Obviously, Jake's been on the pod before, Jake Hight. If you haven't heard that pod and you're listening to this one, definitely make sure you listen to Jake's story, Jake's life story up to now.
My oldest son.
After this one. Yes, your oldest son. Tell me, what was your... have you heard Jake's podcast? Did you listen to it?
Yeah, of course.
Was that the first time you'd heard the Moroccan Mafia story, or were you well aware of that?
No, I was aware of the Moroccan Mafia story, yeah. At the time, he sort of told us from Morocco, but he withheld some information.
Oh, I'm sure he bloody
Which is probably just as well, but, it was a possible, life and death situation, and he lived to tell the tale, and he's quite pleased because he managed to write a song about it. So there you go.
Yeah, he's an artist.
He is an artist. He's definitely an artist. Yeah.
And do you think he must get that off of you, right? Because you've been such an avid sort of punk rock fan, and I guess I don't want to call you a punk rock musician just in case you do other things, you know what I mean? Because I feel like sometimes saying that someone's a punk rock musician is quite limiting, really. I mean, you could be a phenomenal jazz guitarist, and I don't know.
Well, I'm not actually, but no, I get your point. And actually, I grew up with punk. That was my era, so I feel really lucky to have grown up at that time, because it was really exciting, and it said to me. It basically said, do your own thing, do it yourself as well. So It's okay if you only know 3 chords, just go and have a go, So It's all about self-expression, doing your own thing and doing it yourself, So I think and I've kept that. So musically, I've probably, it's been a long time now, but I've tried different things, and I think variety, staying in the same vein, if you like, forever isn't what punk was about either. It's about trying to be different, isn't it? So different journeys through music, different aspects of music. I mean, I love stuff the Stranglers were really the band that really hit me, and at the time people were saying, well, they're not punk, but they were definitely part of it. It was it was that scene.
I think they're punk. I mean, every punk rocker that I know worth their salt will name drop the Stranglers at some point. Our bass player in Sick Ones absolutely adores the Stranglers because of the
bass. Every bass player's got to love JJ Bennell. He made it a lead instrument, really.
Right?
Because he didn't want to sit at the back, being boom, boom, boom. He wanted to
fading into the background. Because generally bassists are very much the introverted member of the band that will, stand at the back, and they're not normally the most animated. I'm not saying that all bassists are sort of boring, but I've seen more bassists than not be the guy that's chilling at the back and holding it down.
Sure.
And there's something about the temperament of most bass players that I think is probably why they're drawn to that instrument, because you've got to be that steady rock, haven't you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Steady Eddie. At times, and really keep the glue together, because us drummers are, we're racked with nervous energy, and sort of, we are Keith Moon inside, and he just happened to be Keith Moon in and outside, but we're that, and although it's our job to keep the time, I tell you what, when I've got George strumming along next to me in Sick Ones, he really does help me sit in that pocket a bit more, and that. So
sure.
that you shouldn't, you can never underestimate the power of a good bass player, I think.
No, absolutely not. It drives it, doesn't it, with the drums? But yeah, definitely. And so that had a big influence on me, and that bass from the Stranglers did as well.
Yeah.
But as far as Jake goes, I mean, he grew up in a musical household, I suppose. So his dad was always recording and playing gigs and writing songs, so he just grew up with that, and it was totally natural for him to do it. So he's probably been writing prolifically since he was 10, 12, something like that, so
wow.
So
he has an output, man.
Yeah, he does. He is quite prolific, but I mean, I didn't grow up in a musical household, so it was the punk thing that made me do it. It was my rebellious thing to do, I suppose,
Yeah.
But I did have a theatrical background. My mum and dad were met in the theatre, and my mum was a poet. She wrote poetry. So I suppose that's come through me, and again to Jake,
Yeah.
You never know how it's going to how it's going to work out, but it certainly has. We're definitely a creative family, not particularly academic.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. You mean, you've written 3 books here on trees, which we will get onto, but I didn't particularly grow up in I would say, a creative or musical household. So yeah, punk for me and heavy music for me was that way in. Like, I think about my family, and I don't know anyone that plays an instrument or anyone that does any real art or writes for the pleasure of writing, anything. So I had to sort of educate myself, I think. And I think punk is that ultimate way in. There's that famous piece of paper that was up on the board at CBGB's, which was like, someone had drawn out 4 chords, and said, here are 4 chords, now go and start a band.
Yeah.
And there was something about the accessibility of punk rock.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there with self-education.
Yeah.
It's almost had self-education has almost had a bad press, if you like. In any line of work, or if you haven't got the degree or you haven't come through the system to learn it, then quite often you haven't been accepted. And I think maybe that's changing now, because I haven't been trained. I mean, I trained as a graphic designer, and that's how I've made my living most of my life. Music was just self-educated, self-taught, and with the trees, it started as a passion, really. It was just a hobby. But 15 years later, I feel that having written 3 books with it's quite a lot of work in there. I feel that I feel that I can sit in a independent seat, if you like, from doing that. And I really like that term, self-educating. I think there's nothing wrong with that.
I think what you've got is something that I think what you're trying to get at there is there's 3 achievements here that no one can take away from you. Doesn't matter what your CV says compared to someone else's. That you have 3 books on a specialist subject that are published, that are written, then no one can take that away from you. No one can say, oh, well, you're self-educated, blah, blah, blah. There's no diminishing your achievement now, because it's real and it's physical. You've manifested it.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's good. I mean, they can criticise it, and that's fair enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I mean,
everyone's an expert, aren't they?
Well, that's the term I don't like, you see. And when people write about me, and they quite often in the introduction they'll say tree expert, and I really don't like that, because I don't consider myself an expert. And the actual term, I just think, if you call yourself an expert, it's you assuming you know everything about something, and learning is a perpetual. You never get to the end, do you? Whatever you're in, music, you'll never learn it all.
Yeah,
it's so I prefer the word specialist.
Yeah. Well, that's, yeah. It sounds corny, but I always say that, I'm a student of rock and roll and I will never graduate.
Yeah, that's
You know what I
good.
mean? Like, and I don't want to either. I'm a student of
No.
music and I will never graduate because I don't want to, because there's always something to learn.
Yeah.
And also there's something humble about what you said, because you're talking about the greatness of Mother Nature, and to call yourself an expert on something so vast and complex and beautiful almost seems a little crass, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And we don't know. There's so much we don't know about nature, and also so much we don't know about trees as well. It's definitely not an exact science. We're learning stuff all the time. I mean, fairly recently there was a book that came out, The Hidden Life of Trees and Secret Life of Trees, and which talks about how the roots connect, say, in a wood or a forest, for instance, and those roots are connected between trees by mycorrhizal fungi, which latches onto the roots to gain nutrients from them. But in the same time as doing that, it's also connecting their roots so they can exchange information and nutrients between themselves. So you could say the whole forest is one entity, and that would have been a fairy tale 20 years ago, but now science backs it up, So there have been studies made, and they're saying, well, yeah, this does happen, So it's incredible, really. I mean, it's quite mind-blowing when you think of it in terms like that, but makes perfect sense, because why wouldn't they do that if it's a key for survival, and adapt to be able to do that?
So does this mean that, say, you've got trees, say the trees in the middle are the ones, the trees on the edges are possibly the ones that are getting the most sunlight because there's nothing to shield them from receiving that sunlight. And does that mean that the trees in the middle get a fairer chance? Is this just so that they can sort of, it's to their, I don't know, it's because there's no conscious thought in it, is there? It's a strange thing to discuss, like there's a plan.
Well, they think that trees that need more, so say for instance the one in the middle that's not getting the light or the nutrients, that's the one that takes the most, so that's
bloody
that's
socialists.
The way to look at it. But actually, as soon as you mention that, this trees in the middle and the ones on the edge, I mean, we've got this idea, we've sort of everyone, I think, in the last 100 years or more has grown up with this idea of forest being this dense wood, this dark place. The thinking now is that our wild wood, if you like, the earliest woodland, when the last ice age retreated, for a long, long time was open. So you would have had a lot of grazing animals naturally munching their way through, keeping the forest open. I mean, take an oak tree. I mean, the trees that I look at, I particularly search out the oldest trees. So I travelled the world to do a world tree book, world tree story, and I wanted to record 100 trees and it was across 40 countries, and it was just a magnificent experience for me over 5 years or so. But they're always open, those big trees don't survive if they're crammed in a wood, So, I mean, you can go to California with the big redwoods, and it's a different story there because things are different in different places. But it's coming back to the UK, our old oak woodlands, oaks don't like being crammed in. They want space. They love the light. And that's where you find the big old trees. If they were crammed in the woods, they wouldn't live for 1,000 years, And
it's so magnificent that they can last that long, that they have the potential, if they're undisturbed by man or lightning or whatever else, can take a tree out, that they can stand for that long. Is there an evolutionary purpose for that they have such a long lifespan? Has that been figured out yet?
It's more a case of, I think, we look at things in human lifespan terms. That's, of course we do, because that's what we are, humans. But you think of human time, but I'd like to think of tree time, which is a whole different
like dog
thing. Years. Yeah, it's exactly like dog years. It's exactly it. So,
right.
I mean, if you think, just take an English oak, if it can live for 1,000 years, they came over to this country from Europe when we were still joined to it physically before the water rose, 10 to 12,000 years ago. So if you're looking at that timescale, you're looking at 10 generations, it could be, back to the last ice age, in tree time. They take their time, you see. It's only decay and possibly disease that gets them. I mean, some trees, they actually regenerate themselves. So they could actually live forever, but they don't, of course.
If something doesn't get them. What is the biggest threat other than mankind to a tree? So let's say a tree is sat in a forest and mankind never sees this forest, never knows it's there, never sets foot in it. What is the biggest killer of trees, and why? Is it like is it fungal? And what does disease look like to trees? Is it rot? What's the biggest danger to trees naturally that isn't us?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I mean, there are tree disease. There's a lot of tree disease in this, say in Britain, for instance. There's, we've had the ash dieback, which came over from Europe and sort of decimated the ash trees in Scandinavia. And they're thinking it's going to do the same here now. It's everywhere. You can't stop it. So that is a pathogen that will kill the tree, if you like. But fungi itself is not necessarily bad. That trees need to have fungi to live. It's part of their existence, as I mentioned earlier, with the root system. That's very much part of a symbiotic relationship, Dutch elm disease killed off all the elms in Britain. There are probably only 1,000 elm trees in England now, whereas they were once as common as the oak. But these were diseases coming in from other countries because of international trade and travel, before they thought to check what was on a boat.
Yeah, I was going to say this, because trees aren't going on holiday.
Exactly.
We're recording this. Unfortunately, we have to do this via the internet because we are unfortunately in the midst of a pandemic. And so what you're describing, I guess, is the tree equivalent of a pandemic.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Trees don't get a passport and go on holiday and travel to other countries or cross into the next town or visit the supermarket or go anywhere that can compromise them. So how do these diseases spread? When you say a pathogen, is there anything that's sort of airborne or?
Well, the ash dieback is airborne, spores of a fungi, if you like. But Dutch elm disease came in with a beetle. So the beetles.
Which one? Ringo? Sorry.
I don't think it was a musical one.
Terrible. Sorry.
So we imported rock elm from Canada, and it didn't come from Holland, funnily enough. We imported rock elm from Canada, which has been felled and shipped over here. And in the bark of these trees that they imported, they brought the beetle in. And so it finds its way and it burrows under the bark, lays its eggs, infects the tree, and 9 times out of 10 kills it,
Right.
So that's how that happened. We've had the same thing going the other way. There's an Asian beetle that has carried a disease to America and infected their ash. And so they've got a real problem with that. And it's because I think it's that international trade, which of course is good for us really, but probably didn't think about these effects that would happen, because when very much every country's got its own treescape and own kind of trees that they've developed to suit that country, the climate, the landscape, etc. And for for millions of years or thousands of years, say for Britain, for instance, we're an island. We've been an island for 7,000 years, 6,000 years. So nothing's changed in that. Because looking in tree time, they adapt to suit their environment, So
any foreign elements coming in, they can be what's the word? Compromised.
Absolutely.
So like in the same way that when the Americans when we landed in the Americas and we went and saw the native tribes, we spread disease and wiped some of them out in the same way as if we went to the Amazon and found a tribe and we went and shook their hand. There's a very real possibility that the things that don't even make a dent in our immune system
will kill them off. And that's happened time and again. And it's because they've got no immunity to even the common cold, because they've had no exposure to it, So it's exactly the same, I suppose.
Yeah.
Really. And also in the same way that in the 1850s, a rich landowner brought in the grey squirrel from America as a sort of status symbol, and having no idea that within 100 years, it would have colonised the whole island and pretty much wiped out our native reds, It's that kind of thing.
Ecology is fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
It's a Game of Thrones.
It really is, and it's this idea of everything being natural. You quite often hear, well, we want it to be natural, and then you've got to ask yourself, well, what is natural, And quite often we take ourselves out of that equation, but people have always been here with trees for as long as they've been in Britain, So we're a part of it. And obviously there's a lot more of us now, and we're more industrialised, and we're much more dangerous to them, I suppose. But you've got to, I think it's important to include us in the story, because we're not separate to it. We're part of it,
Integral part of it, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why do these tree, are they called tree pandemics? Is this what we're going to call them, or do they have a term? Is there a?
I think I think you've just coined the right term, Andy. I haven't heard that before, but yeah, I think that we should start using that.
All right, a tree pandemic. How do these begin? Because I know with human pandemics, the reason that we're being told this is happening and may happen again in the future at increasing rates is it's our further encroachment onto nature, which is forcing different forms of livestock and wildlife in closer proximity to each other, where these illnesses can mutate between the species and eventually get to a point where it can become, what do they call it? It's zoological or something, and then it comes to a point where we can catch it. And so with a human pandemic, the rules are very different. But is that the same with tree stuff? Is it because there's people start planting different things nearer to other trees? What's the how does that form? That was a very long-winded, weird question for you. I appreciate that, but
yeah, well, I'll try and answer. I don't know if I can, because I'm certainly not an expert on this. I mean, but yeah, it's the movement of pathogens, for instance. It's the movement. It's bringing it in. So we've brought them in plants, in pots from other countries, and we've probably exported some as well.
Yeah.
So I think you take somewhere like Australia, where they've got really tight borders on, they won't even let you in with mud on your shoes at the airport, that kind of thing. Just trying to minimalise that transportation of things you don't want, really,
Yeah.
But obviously the cat's out of the bag with a lot of those things now. So we'll just have to see what happens. It's difficult.
It's fascinating. So tell me where your love of trees began. So you're a punk rocker, and you love trees. Now that usually is reserved for, you're a dirty hippie in the original punk rock scene. If you were you love trees in nature, you were a tree hugging hippie, and you couldn't be trusted, in the words of I think who was that? Johnny Rotten.
That was Johnny Rotten. Yeah, never trust a hippie.
So did you find your love of trees from being chained to them, protecting them at some Greenpeace event somewhere, or what was the?
No, much earlier than that. I was a kid. I was a young boy, I suppose, and I grew up in a housing estate, but behind our housing estate there was some woodland. There was 8 acres of woodland. So as well as playing in the street, we used to go and play in the woods and climb trees, build camps, all that kind of thing. And there was a lot of kids down our street. There's probably about 20 of us. And we used to just, in the days when you left your back door open, you could just go off until it was dark and come back home, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I feel really lucky to have had that. And it was in Surrey. I think that's where I got my love of nature. So sometimes when the other kids had gone home, I would stay in the woods, or I'd go there on my own and just sit there, and I'd see deer and foxes and, just appreciate nature, really. But we were quite close to Windsor. Windsor Great Park was one of the first royal forests. When William the Conqueror came over in 1066, he made Windsor one of his early strongholds. So he set up a royal forest, which was basically a place for him to go and hunt. And nobody else was allowed on the land because it was his, So there are trees there that survived from that period. So although he didn't intend to create this beautiful ancient tree landscape, in effect, that's his legacy, in one part of his legacy, So, and we used to, the main road goes right through the middle of Windsor Park, near Windsor Castle. And it's all parkland with wonderful, amazing ancient trees. I mean, it's got hundreds of big, fat, hollow oaks that have been there for 500, 1,000 years, some of them, So I used to see those sitting in the back of the car with my dad when he'd take me to his warehouse. He was a publisher, and he'd take me to the book warehouse in Slough, and we'd go through Windsor on the way, and I'd see these amazing trees, and they just fascinated me and sparked my imagination even as a youngster. It's that sense of history, what's happened under these trees what stories could they tell? That's another cliche, and people always say it, but it fascinated me from an early age. So I suppose I grew up with that passion, but I didn't do anything with it. I'd always appreciated it, but I got into publishing because as a graphic designer, a book designer, and I worked for this company called Francis Frith Collection, and they've got a historic archive of Britain in photographs dating back to the 1860s. Oh, so beautiful. You can look at your town in years gone by, that kind of thing. It's a really fascinating resource. You see your own town, and that's when it really hits you because you recognise it. But it's 150 years ago, And I stumbled across a photograph of this tree called the Major Oak, which is in Sherwood Forest, which, of course, is where Robin Hood was supposed to be. So They call this tree the Robin Hood tree, and I'd visited it on a school trip. And it's 10 metres in circumference. It's completely hollow. You could stand inside it comfortably, It may be 1,000 years old. So I remember seeing it visiting as a kid and looking at this old photo. I thought it just rekindled that memory. Yeah. And I thought, let's go there on holiday. I would want to go and see it. So I went there and I took my camera. I took a photograph of it. And then I noticed that the difference in 150 years was basically, you couldn't tell the difference. It was 150 years had passed. The tree looked exactly the same, had the same shape, the same character. And we don't know how old they are. I keep saying 1,000 years, 500 years, but we don't really know because the only way of dating a tree accurately is to take a core sample, with an increment borer, and then literally count the tree rings. But because our ancient trees are always hollow, because they don't need the inner rings to survive, so it decays, you can't get an accurate date. So it's always an estimate.
Right, I see.
So, and that started my journey on books. Then I found another old photo and another, and it just spiraled and became an obsession, took my life over and sent me around the world, really, But so that's how it happened.
Mate, our obsessions should take us around the world. That's
I agree.
That's it's a beautiful thing. And I do want to talk about your travels as well, because I've always been drawn to people who've travelled, and I've always aspired to be well travelled, because I do believe that it does kick off ignorance, and it fends off ignorance and stagnation of culture, cultural stagnation. But what you talked about when you grabbing a core sample for the listener, I think I understand what it is. But when you have a piece of cheese and you want to taste it, and they plunge that round thing into it, and then they pull it out, and there's a piece of cheese from the middle, and you've got the whole sort of outer layer into the middle. That is essentially what you're doing with the tree. Is that correct? So
that's exactly it. So it's like a big corkscrew, and you literally screw it into the tree, and it's only sort of 10-15 mil wide, so it does minimal damage really. And you can go to the core of the tree, and then when you take it out, it brings that sample out with it, and you can put it under a microscope and literally count the rings, because obviously a tree grows a new ring every year, So what I did find out, and what makes me the reason I can say almost with confidence is that oak trees can live for 1,000 years, is because I went to America, and what I found there, they've got the biggest, the tallest, and the oldest trees all in America, all in California.
Of course they would. Everything's bigger and better and stuff in America, isn't it? Even the trees.
The thing about their trees is that the giant redwoods and another tree called a bristlecone pine. Lots of the trees, they don't decay inside, so they don't hollow out like our trees do. Sometimes they do, but not always. So a lot of the trees have got that ring going right to the centre, and so they looked at the giant sequoias, and they found that one of them was 3,200 years old. Wow. That is proven fact. There's no disputing that. It's scientifically proven. So, and this was one of the giant sequoias, the big redwoods, So, and they thought, well, because they're the biggest tree in the world, they must be the oldest. But there was a guy called Ed Shulman who looked in the next mountain range along, which is Sierra Nevada, not from the Sierra Nevada in the White Mountains. And there is this grove of trees. There's an ancient forest of bristlecone pines, and they're little stunted pine trees, pretty small and stunted, and only got half the bark on them. They look half dead, if you like. Right. But he had an idea these were really old, so he took core samples of those, and he found one to be 5,000 years old.
Wow!
So we know that trees can live for that long. And there's an old English saying that says about oaks that said 300 years young, 300 mature, 300 in decay, So that covers that millennial period, if you like. So that makes me think, trees can live that long, So why can't ours,
And I guess by that measure, they age a little bit like we do. And you said he only had half the bark, and it was a bit, is it visually you look at that tree and go, oh, this one has weathered some actual literal storms.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and what happens? Say, take an ancient oak. I mean, you think of a beautiful oak as these big trees, but as they get older, they grow down. So, part of their survival strategy is to literally grow down. So they lose the top canopy. Right. You've probably seen stag-headed branches sometimes, and you can almost see that second canopy evolving as they grow down to conserve energy. They get big and fat and hollow out, and then become, as in the process, giving life as they decay. So all that decaying wood gives life to so many other species,
Oh, it is beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's returning to the earth.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And they're also composting themselves. So all the decay in the inside of the wood they no longer need is decayed by fungi and beetles, etc. And it breaks down into the base of the tree and feeds the tree at the same time,
It's perfect, isn't it?
It is perfect. Yeah, fantastic.
It's bloody great. So I want to get into how once you decided that you were obsessed with trees, and this was your. Do you feel like you had an inner compass that just said, "Yeah, this is actually where you need to be right now. This is what we feel." As in the we, I don't know, the collective, not the collective we, whatever. That we have decided that this is where we need to go. You, your head, your heart, your gut. Did you feel that quite strongly?
Yes. I mean, at first, not necessarily at first. It was almost accidental, to be honest with you, because, like I say, it just started as a passion and then a hobby. But once I started looking at these old photographs, I started discovering more and more. And the Victorians kept a really great record, of major landmarks, beautiful trees that they were starting to go and visit, that kind of thing, and give names. They started to name them, the Druid's Oak or Queen Elizabeth's Oak, or, all this kind of thing, or romantic notion of their surroundings. So there's a real a wealth of material to draw on. And I thought, this is a book, because I was in publishing. It's a book, there's a book in this. So I started trying to put it together with the publishing company I was working for, who were going to do it. It didn't happen. But then the further I went, the more into it I got, and I was convinced it was it's got legs, it's got to work. And then it took hold, I suppose. And because I was in publishing, I think actually, because it was my working life, I always had a trouble promoting my music as a musician, And I think musicians, people say, what kind of music do you do? And it was like, well, I still can't answer that question because I mean, you can say you're in a punk rock band, but I think I was trying to not necessarily do punk, and I couldn't describe what my music was. Someone else probably could have done, And I think that's why maybe as a musician you need an agent or a manager or someone who's slightly distanced from it, who can sell it better, basically. I found it really difficult to sell music. For some reason I didn't find it difficult to sell the book, probably because I'd been working in it as a business, if you like,
And there's often not to digress too much with the music, but often with music there's an awkward conversation around money, and so a lot of people don't know how to sell their art or make money out of their music. And for some reason, music doesn't always, if you're an unproven artist, it doesn't always seem to hold any value for people. And that's the weird thing, isn't it? It's when you apply for a job and they say, well, you need experience. And it's like, well, I would get some experience if you'd hire me. So it's a bit like that, isn't it? It's like, well, we're not going to invest in this music until you've proven to have to have sold some or been successful. And then it's like, well, if you invest in it now, then it'll happen.
I get that. So, well, actually, talking in that sense, I suppose the punk rock background sort of manifested itself in my publishing books as well, because
You just do it yourself.
I did eventually. I mean, the first book, I went to every publisher in London and I got some really good bites. And it was like trying to get a record deal in that same way. You're banging on the door. You're saying, "This, look at my book," and I thought it was going to happen a few times, and it's quite often that you're there, and then it goes quiet and it doesn't happen, And I'd got to the point where I thought, I've been everywhere. I don't know what to do to make this work, And someone suggested to me, they said, send it to the National Trust, they'd love this. And I said, well, actually, they've got another guy working on an ancient tree book at the moment. And, that's why I haven't been to them, because they've got someone. But I just sent it anyway as a last sort of ditch attempt. And they rang me straight up. And within a week, I had a publishing deal, because the guy who'd written their book had given them a text, and apparently it was a huge tome. And they said, look, we want to do something mainstream. We're going to have to edit this down. And the writer, I don't know who it was, said, you're not editing a word of it. No. So they fell out. And that time that happened was when my book fell on their desk, and that filled the slot they'd already had. So it's a right place, right time thing.
I was just about to say, it's the story of me. I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and that's fantastic. What I am interested in as well is how you self-taught. I mean, it's very easy to self-teach, isn't it, when you're obsessed with something, because you're in sponge mode because your heart is in it. So how while you're holding down a job, is Jake born at this point? Have you got your kids?
Yes, Jake was born. Yeah, Jake was definitely born. I mean, this all started, I suppose.
Oh, it's 2011, isn't it? Of course, he was born.
Yeah, the book came out. Yeah. So the book. That's when the book was published. But I've been working on it since sort of 2005, 2006, something like that. It take me 5 years to do these books, because it's a long process to research and travel and then put it all together. So they take me 4 or 5 years to do. So
Jake was considerably younger than he is now at this point, and so you had to juggle that. And
I did, but I'd take him with me. So it was, I was working full time at the time. So for a company, so it would be weekends, holidays. My whole family had to sort of pitch in, really. I was very lucky to have a forgiving family to do that. But we'd go for a walk in the woods, like, let's go and see this tree, or whatever, So, and Jake used to come with me as a young boy, and you'll see him in my first book in a lot of the photographs, because I always try and put people in the photographs, because just give some perspective on the sense of scale, the size of these trees, because if you don't have a person there, it just looks like a tree. You put someone in with a tree, and suddenly you go, wow, that's huge, So, and it visually dates it, and I'm hoping maybe in 100 years, someone will look at my photos as I've looked at the Victorian ones. Yeah. Because when you see, you get that period in your head. Then, do you know what I mean? It's historic photographic dating, really.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of that.
Let's move on to your world travels. Is that book 2? Yeah.
Yeah.
In 2015, that comes out. And so you've brought out the first book via the National Trust, and it's called Britain's Tree Story. Does it sell well? Is it a good? Because I'm wondering how you fund all the trips that then happen for you to research the second book. Is there an advance on this book? What's the deal there?
Yeah, I got an advance on the first book, so much as like you would with a record deal, the same kind of thing. And then you get royalties paid once that advance is reached. So I think they printed 7,000 with the first print run, which was actually for these days is quite a good number. But I think they were expecting that to be it, But it's actually reprinted every year since 2011. So every other year, a couple of times. But it's hit 8 reprints, and they're going to reprint again next month. So I think they were very shocked that happened, because they weren't expecting it, So it's hit a chord somewhere. And I haven't made a lot of money out of that first book, because you don't get much royalties as a new author, but it has opened the door for me, as someone who's serious about it.
Yeah,
and people have seen it. It's a high quality book. It's they're very heavily illustrated, so there's a lot of nice pictures. There's text as well, but it's quite photographic. So the idea is you can dip in and out, coffee table kind of book.
Yeah.
So for the second book, I went back to National Trust and said, look, I'm going to do, because I'd travelled all over Britain for the first book. And then when it was over, it's like, well, what am I going to do with myself? I know, I'll go around the world and do the same thing, which was, I sort of made a rod for my own back, but it was that same dedication to it again. You know, once I'd made a decision, I was going to do it.
Yeah.
And I tried to get it published by National Trust, but they said, no, we're National Trust. We only do UK, you know. So I looked further afield, and it was the same story again. But I thought, well, look, I know how to do it now. I'm a graphic designer. I can design it myself. So I hired an editor, a girl called Anna Carr in my town, Frome, and she edited the book with me. So I had some feedback there, because you often don't see your own mistakes, that kind of thing.
Oh, I know.
So I did it myself and self-published. But then you've got a whole, oh crikey, there's a whole new world, you know, distribution. All the major outlets, they don't buy from little men like me. They want to buy from a distributor central. So then I had to go to find a distributor who take my books, and they say, "Oh no, we don't take from sort of one-man band kind of things." And I said, "Well, my last book sold over 30,000 copies," and they went, "Oh yeah, okay, we'll do it." That kind of thing. So it opened the door in that sense, you know.
Yeah.
And I haven't looked back really.
And so where do you, again, we're going to use a musical analogy, you're going to have to be you're going to have to be your own tour manager, I guess, at some point and track a route.
Yeah.
And I haven't really booked any of my own tours. I've been very lucky that bandmates and others have done it for me, but there's routing involved, isn't there? And logistics. And it's like, well, if we're going here, we may as well try and get a show there and here and there and blah, 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 blah. So how did you plan out your world tour around trees to be the most economic in terms of your carbon footprint and your expenditure?
Yes, carbon footprint is a really good point, actually. And so I tried to do, I mean, obviously I could travel around Europe. I could go by train. I use my bike a lot, actually. I did drive some of it. I've got to say, I did use EasyJet for other places. Going to America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand
was unavoidable, isn't it?
It is really, but I was driven to do it, you know. So, and it wasn't all on a shoestring. Everything was on a shoestring because I was still working at the time when I did most of my travels for the World Tree Story book. So I had some funding for myself, but I had no support from anybody else. So I sold a lot. I've lived in the same house for 20 years. I found that I had a lot of stuff I didn't need. So I basically almost sold everything. I kept my guitars, you know. And so any way I could find to help finance that. And it would be every holiday, every weekend. I could do weekend trips to Europe. I ended up going to 39 countries, you know. And it was magnificent. I think you've got to have a little bit of obsessional nature to be able to do that, really. Because like you said, you know, I was the logistics manager. I was the tour manager, if you like. And I always wanted to tour the world with a band. It never happened for me. I toured the world for trees instead. So I'd go out in the day from dawn to dusk looking at trees, photographing them. And then at the night time, I'd try and soak up some of the culture of wherever I was, you know, because again, it's about people and trees. It's not, I try and put our relationship with them, you know, and what they've meant to us and the stories that have happened underneath them, you know, in that time. So,
I love that. Touring the world with, you know, trees, you know, this is a tough crowd. They're so wooden.
Yeah.
Oh dear, that is. I do like that aspect though of the human aspect when it comes to trees and part of, but being part of the story, because I imagine probably, maybe not probably, but in a tribal sense, I think trees may have different importance as well. There may be ceremonial aspects to things, and you know, like a bonsai tree, for example, is a symbol of other. I don't know what the symbol of it is, other than you know you maintain it and you're responsible for it, aren't you? I think that's sort of the.
It's a relationship, isn't it? It's a relationship. I think I went to Japan, and it was one of the most fantastic places that I visited, and it was just full of surprises for me. Because you've got when you visit anywhere, you've got an idea of how you expect it to be. But when you get there, invariably, it might be like that. But you're usually quite wrong in some cases. And Japan was like that. It was just full of surprises. The country, you know, you've got this you've got this historic tradition, in Japan, but you've also got the latest technology and everything, and it sits side by side, in quite comfortably, really. It's strange how it works. Really friendly people, but as far as the trees go, I mean, the country's 75% mountains. So I've got an idea that bonsai, was started because they had little space, and they like to make these Japanese gardens which mimicked the natural landscape in miniature, if you like. You see it everywhere in the shrines. So I think maybe it came from that, but they're meticulous in their attention to detail. I mean, a bonsai, they'll take a pine tree in Japan and make it into a bonsai, and they prune every needle individually. That's how meticulous they are. But what I found with the ancient trees, the big old trees, and Japan in particular, actually, was why they survive. They're not just there. A tree's pretty lucky to have stayed there for 1,000 years, and there's always a reason, and it's usually down to us if they're in a community of people. So in Japan, the ancient trees survive because they're sacred trees. They've still got their Shinto religion, which is, if you like, a pagan religion, where they think the spirits or the gods are in certain landmarks. So it could be a waterfall, the god would be in the waterfall, or a rock, or a tree. Right. So some of these trees are the spirits. So they survive in the shrines, in the Japanese shrines. So you'll go and visit the sacred temple and literally pray to the tree. There was one great camphor tree. They thought it was 1,000 years old. It's 30 meters in circumference. It's an absolute giant,
Wow.
And people queue up to pray, and they do a little clap, and then they do a bow, and they say their prayer to the tree, and then walk around the tree once, and make a wish, of whatever's troubling you at that time. It was just fantastic to see, and it was so natural. And I think that kind of thing was definitely happened in this country and other European countries where it may be lost in now. Christianity changed that in a big way, but say pre-Christianity, the old yew trees in our churchyards, that were quite often there before the churches were built,
Right.
And they were probably sacred trees to an earlier religion.
Right.
So there's definitely that human spiritual connection as well, It's fascinating, really.
It is. How a lot of Eastern religion or philosophy is often deeply rooted in the symbiotic nature of us and the land, and how it, so often in the West, and I'm a complete hypocrite, but so often in the West, we just take from the land, don't we? We just take. It is there to provide things for us. But I think in Eastern thinking is that it's a give and take, isn't it? And that you must. I mean, it's in the Bible, isn't it? It's in the Western Bible of Christianity, isn't it? Is that we're here to look after the earth and everything, So I guess it is sort of present for us. But I just feel like out east, they're just far more mindful of the world and nature as a whole, and it being part of their lives.
I suppose because it's civilization and urbanization has played a big key role in sort of detaching us from that, really.
Right. Yes.
I think that's probably what it is, and a lot more people and a lot less space as well is another thing.
Yeah.
But I think maybe with this, with the COVID and the lockdown and people going out and walking in the woods, or especially where we live, it's more difficult in a city, of course. But if you can get out to some beautiful spot and have a walk, and realizing how good it is for you,
Yeah.
What a good thing it is to do. And I think that's really opened up for a lot of people, that is the one positive I can think of about COVID, the whole COVID situation, is that people are enjoying their environment and thinking more about that aspect of it,
Yeah, I mean, I bumped into a friend of mine's parents in the first lockdown, and they've lived 20 minutes away from this woods for 20 years or something, and they were like, "Oh, we've just discovered this these woods," and they were like, "Oh, it was so beautiful. It was full of bluebells, and there was no one there, and it was just the most beautiful, untouched." Thing, and they were like, "Oh, we couldn't believe that it's been there all along, and we never found it."
Yeah, I think some eyes are being opened.
Yeah.
because of that, because people are getting out there, and hopefully that'll have a beneficial impact, really. You know. That's my hope anyway. I mean, some doctors are prescribing a walk in the woods, to help with depression and other mental illness, that kind of thing. And I know from experience, I do it all the time. I need to get out and do that for my own well-being. It makes you feel good. Trees give out pheromones which make you feel good. It's such a natural thing. So yeah, hopefully that's going to have a good effect. We're up against all sorts of human disasters at the moment concerning our trees, but I think you've got to try and keep hold of the positive. And what I've noticed from doing my books, and I may notice it because I'm involved in it. I did do a lot of talks before the lockdowns, that kind of thing. So I'm meeting people all the time. But I just think it's it's blossoming.
Yeah.
It's growing. That no pun intended. People getting in touch with nature again, really, which I think is so important and so natural. There's nothing hippie about it, really. It's the most natural thing in the world, as far as I can see.
Well, the other thing I was going to ask you is, have you been to that, and I don't want to make this morbid, but there's a famous forest in Japan which is famous for suicides. Did you visit that forest? Is there anything particular about that forest that you've heard of that, is of note?
In a word, no, I haven't been there. No, sorry.
Oh, it's a hotspot for suicides, and it's
right. Can you remember what it's called?
I'm not sure. I think it's just called the Suicide Forest or something like that, and it sits at the base of Mount Fuji, I believe. Well, Mount Fuji is very visible from it. And there was a YouTuber that went to Japan and did a vlog, and he went into the forest, and they were walking around and everything, and they were being very like, oh, this is the suicide forest, and a little bit most haunted about it, and looking around, and then they actually did stumble across someone. They'd found someone, and he decided stupidly to post the video on the internet of it in the vlog. And he caught an awful lot of flack for it, for being incredibly insensitive and, trying to capitalise on the shock value of it. And I think it just put that forest on the map a little. And I just didn't know whether there may have been a little bit more to it. I know the suicides thing has nothing to do with the trees necessarily, but I'm wondering if there was any special reason that it was in that particular forest, whether there was any tradition or mythology around it where people would choose to go to that place of all places to do it.
Well, I don't know, but it does remind there is a lot of suicide in Japan. I do know that, from different reasons to how it used to be historically. But the tradition in Japan, the samurai way, there's no shame in hagakure from putting the sword in yourself, basically. So, and it's dying beautiful as well. So maybe doing it in a forest is that beauty attached to it,
potentially.
Because in Japan, they've actually got, they sort of invented this term forest bathing, which is now swept across the world, where you go into the woods to literally bathe in the forest, in the sense that you're absorbing everything around you, and that's been something that's been done a long time in Japan. It's now coming over to the West, as a thing to do, the latest fad, if you like, but actually it's a really good fad. I mean, they've discovered that trees give off pheromones that do make you feel good. And for instance, there's a thing where trees are supposed to talk to each other, and I don't like the term talk to each other because that assumes they talk like you and I, but I do think communicate. They definitely communicate. So if an oak is being attacked by insects, it'll give off a pheromone which lets the other trees know that's happening. So and it's only localized, so that pheromone will sweep across to the other trees. And when they sense that, they fill their leaves with tannins. And the insects come onto that tree and they don't like the taste of the leaves, because they've pushed out the tannin. I mean, that's just an amazing thing, isn't it? So there's all this chemical thing. There's all these chemicals going on in a forest. Different trees have different ones, and it definitely has an effect on us as people. It can make you feel good about yourself. I know if I'm in a bad mood and I go to the woods, within 10 minutes, usually, unless it's something particularly drastic, I feel that that's lifted. It's a good thing to do. Also, talking about Japan and the forest thing. When I went to Japan, I went in the spring because I want to see the cherry blossom, basically. So, which is a massive thing in Japan. It's there's a thing called the Sakura Zensen, and which means following the cherry blossom. So, because Japan's long and thin, north to south, you can follow the blossoming of the cherry trees, and it's such a fleeting beauty that it's become impassioned with the whole nation. They love it. They go out and they have parties in the parks for that fleeting beauty, and then it's gone. So it's that beautiful death again. It comes into it, if you like.
That's amazing. Some of my favourite memories of growing up were near where we live here in Frome. There's a village called Chapmanslade, which is where my grandparents live, where my grandmother lives. My grandfather's no longer with us, and that's where my dad grew up. And so when I would be dropped off there for school holidays and some odd weekend bits and pieces to, spend time with the grandparents and, let my parents go to work or whatever when I was younger, one of the things that my grandfather used to do, because I've got ADHD and obviously as a kid, that's a lot of energy already on top of a lot of energy. And so one of the things he would do, I think, would probably be like, right, let's get the wellies on. Let's go down the woods. Let's get the dogs out. We go down the woods because I can just get let loose in there. And those are some of my favourite memories, is running around with trees, with sticks and whacking them against the trees and, running up and down because it's quite hilly. There's inclines and stuff. And there's a funny thing that I seem to remember is I enjoy it when I was younger. But then I realised that when I got older and I started to get into my teens a little bit, my younger teens, and you start getting the a bit of testosterone and all these you're starting to sort of puberty's hitting, and that's when I sort of became far more destructive, and any rotten tree stump and everything that was getting karate kicked and destroyed. And it's weird, you can map it. The older I got, the angrier things got in there, but there's such good memories of just running around.
Well, how is it now, Andy? What's it like when you go there now? Have you calmed down a bit now?
Yeah, I've leveled out.
I know that word. It's Black Dog Wood, isn't it?
That's it, yeah.
How it got the name Black Dog Wood. The story goes that there were two suitors who both fancied the maiden, and they both wanted her hand in marriage, and they couldn't sort this out between themselves. So the two guys decided to have a duel in Black Dog Wood. So, in the 1850s this would have been. So it was 40 paces, walk away from each other with the pistols, turn and fire. One of the guys shot the other guy dead. Mm-hmm. But the guy who he shot had a black dog who then attacked the guy who'd shot him and mauled him to death. And the maiden, distraught, committed suicide and was buried at Dead Maid's Cross, they call it.
Yes, which is just down the road.
And that's why it's Dead Maid's Cross. And that's why they call it Black Dog Woods. And apparently, if you I probably shouldn't say it, but if you see a black dog in the woods, you're not going to survive very long, apparently.
So that I think there was probably a reason I wasn't told that story as a child,
possibly
was that I would come running back to the top of the woods having thought I'd seen some sort
of... So whether that's, based on any truth or not, I don't know.
Never let the truth get in the way of the good story.
Well, do you know what? And I agree. I know that, but... I use mythology and legend in my books all the time.
Right.
And I don't necessarily make a distinction from history because I think it's just as important because it's how the locals have believed it,
Yeah.
And quite often there's a nugget of truth in there, but...
colloquially,
yeah.
Black Dog's Wood. Can you tell me, on that subject then, can you tell me about a few other places you visited in the world that have myths attached to them or sort of a supernatural element to their sort of appeal?
Yeah, and the same kind of things happen wherever you go, with different people. So America hasn't got such a great history. Of course, the Native Americans were there long before. But I couldn't find a lot out about that, because they didn't have the written records, and maybe a lot of it's been lost, the oral records, But somewhere like New Zealand, which has got the Maori culture. They've got these giant trees in New Zealand, in the North Island, called kauri trees. I mean, we think of New Zealand as being a little bit. People often liken it to Wales. You know, the rolling green hills and the sheep. But of course, that's the way it's become westernised. When the Europeans first got there, actually, my family were early settlers in New Zealand. In 1853, they took a boat from Gravesend to New Zealand, which took 3 months. Over time, 23 people died on the ship on the way there. And when they got there was no one to meet them. And they just came across this rainforest island, you know, and had to hack their way in and try and make a living, you know. And they're still there. They've been there ever since. It's an amazing story. But of course, when they got there, the Maoris had already been living there for almost 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And but they'd lived with the forest, you know, these giant kauri trees, which are a little bit like this, think of the redwoods, that kind of scale, you know. They almost look like upside down trees. And the story goes, the biggest tree there, which it's 2,000 years old. Again, they can date it with the ring boring, you know. A 2,000-year-old tree, it's called Tane Mahuta, and it's named after the god of the forest, who was Tane.
Right.
And apparently he created the forest and then put birds in the forest, you know, so he's the god of the forest, if you like. But he realised that when he was planting the trees, the very first trees, he thought he'd put them in upside down. So he pulled them all up and stuck them back in the other way because the branches look like roots, you know. So that's where these creation stories come from. But you've got the same story happening in Africa with the baobab trees.
Okay.
They call those upside down trees as well because apparently they were put in the wrong way. So there's these similarities that prop up all over the world because people aren't that different, I don't think, wherever you know, we're all different. We've got different culture and customs, but as basic people,
we're all wired the same, aren't we?
Pretty much.
We're all evolved to seek the same patterns, I guess.
Yeah.
And I guess you will have some overlap in that regard. That's bloody fascinating. That is. I love that. We're very lucky to have Longleat Park close to where we live, and they have. Again, I am not a tree specialist. Notice how I didn't say expert.
Yeah, well,
I'm not a tree specialist, but I believe they have quite the collection of different trees there, don't they? It's quite a smorgasbord, if you will, of
Yeah, they've got their own kind of arboretum, and what I've found is, I mean, Longleat for us living in this part of the world, that's the nearest to Frome. That's the best place for ancient trees, you know. And it almost gives you a picture of what our ancient treescape looked like. So that when I was talking about the open grown trees, you call it wood pasture, you know. So you've got these big trees spaced apart with lots of grazing animals in between them, making use of the shade, you know. What happened as life develops and we became more civilized, then people bought these big plots of land and made their estates, and they'd almost emulate that wood pasture landscape, which became called parkland, you know, which was a bit more tidy. Parkland is like tidy wood pasture, if you like. So looking at that, if you look across at Longleat, you can see there's loads of big trees everywhere, but there's space between them, isn't there? So they would have had their deer park in there. I mean, I've been lucky enough to record trees for the Woodland Trust Ancient Tree Inventory, which is a database for our ancient trees, because we knew we had a lot in Britain, but we didn't know how many. So they started an online database where you can literally add your own trees. You can go and take a photograph of it, record it, measure it at chest height to get a circumference, which gives an indicator of age. You know, the bigger the older generally. So I got permission to go and photograph and record all the trees at Longleat. So I've added about 500 trees. Some of those trees you could say, although there's a lot of plantings from around the world, because as with the squirrels, they wanted status, bring in these new trees, grow these great trees. There are also some amazing native trees that could be, I mean, there's a tree there, I call it the Lion of Longleat. It's 8 metres in circumference. It's completely hollow.
Right.
I've seen barn owls and bats fly out of it, and ravens and buzzards in its branches. It's a biodiversity hotspot. You know, oaks can support 3,000 species of animal, you know. So you've got one ecosystem in one tree. You know, some creatures will never leave it except to maybe go and mate and move to another tree. So they're really great for biodiversity, these trees, you know. And I've got an idea that tree could be 750 years old, which predates even Longleat. You know, the family have owned that estate for 500 years. But prior to that, it was a monastery, and it was probably in the monastery grounds, you know. It's just incredible, really. So yeah, we're very lucky to have that, and that's where I find myself a lot in this country is on manorial estates, because that's where these trees have had the time and space to stay there.
That is absolutely amazing. There's a tree there. Is it called a monkey tree? Is that right? Is that the definition for it? It's the tree that monkeys find it very hard to climb because of its.
Is it the monkey puzzle tree?
Monkey puzzle tree, yes.
From Chile. They're a Chilean tree, yeah. Have they got one at Longleat, have they?
I think there's one, Heaven's Gate that overlooks...
Yeah.
I believe on the path, unless I've got it wrong, maybe it was many, many years. Someone pointed it out to me years ago when I was there and said, this is that tree and this is why it's called that tree.
I haven't seen one in the Parkland, but I do know in Southley Woods, which they also own, there's an ancient monument called Robin Hood's Bower, which is an earthwork, which probably dates back to Alfred's time. It's supposedly where King Alfred met his troops, and they've planted that out with monkey puzzle trees completely.
Right.
So there are about 50 monkey puzzle trees in there.
But what is a monkey puzzle tree for the listener? It's a unique looking tree, isn't it?
Yeah, it grows in Chile, in the western part of Chile, and of course it's called a monkey puzzle tree because it's covered in these spiky leaves all over. So it's sort of, it would be impossible for a monkey to climb it, apparently.
And is that an evolutionary response?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, definitely. It definitely would be an evolution. So what exactly? I'm not exactly sure, but it's probably to protect itself from certain animals. Trees, because of their slow metabolism, they start to develop this thick bark to protect themselves against the fauna that lived around at the time, the big beasts that have slowly died out. So, if you take a redwood tree in America, it's got 2 foot thick bark on a giant scoriae has got bark that's 2 foot thick. And the reason for that is because of forest fires. And we don't have that so much in this country because it's a damper climate. But in California, it's very dry and hot. You get these forest fires happening, and that's what actually makes the fir cones open, is the fire, so that they can regenerate, because everything's been burnt away. There's a nice layer of ash for them to grow in, So they develop this 2 foot thick bark so they can survive the fire, and at the same time it opens the cones, and then and then off they go again,
Again, nature is perfect, isn't it?
Almost, yeah.
It's just
it finds a way, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Which is that Jurassic Park quote, isn't it? Life finds a way.
I didn't know I'd got it from there, but maybe subconsciously
I think that's the Talking of Jurassic Park, do you have any facts or knowledge about prehistoric trees? Or maybe that's the wrong word. Trees from a sort of more dinosaur era, because of course there's herbivore dinosaurs, aren't there, that would be eating trees and leaves and things, I'd assume. Would that mean that there'd be other species that have maybe been wiped out due to that, or is there evolutionary traits? So maybe the monkey puzzle tree is, a response to, like you said, predatorial, or maybe not predators if they're carnivores, but being eaten and picked at and whatever.
Yeah, well, like everything, trees have developed, So in dinosaur times, the treescape would have been very different to now, I think. But having said that, I'm going to have to look at my book to get this right. But one of the first trees was called Archaeopteris, and there's nothing like it now. But they think that was a predecessor of of trees of today. That was 170 million years ago. So that's a long way to look back, isn't it? But my knowledge basically, I'm looking at you say prehistoric, but we have prehistoric trees in this country living now. I say that the oaks live for 1,000 years, but yew trees they think can live for 2, 3, maybe 4,000 years. And you've got 5,000-year-old trees in America, so they are prehistoric. Pre-BC, if you like. So. But I think the sense you're looking at, there was a tree in China called the ginkgo, which you've probably heard of. There's one outside the library in Frome. It's got beautiful yellow leaves. Right. That was a prehistoric tree. So that has been around for a very, very long time. And they thought it was extinct in the wild. And then in the 1930s or 1940s, somebody found a valley in China where the the very last of them was growing wild, and they thought they'd gone. And now they're planted everywhere,
Yeah.
So they've revived that tree, and you've even got them outside the library in Frome, so that is a prehistoric tree. Oaks, even though they live for 1,000 years compared to those that haven't got such a long lineage, but.
Right. Tell me about your your activism and deforestation, because I assume your activism it goes hand in hand with deforestation.
Yes, naturally, I suppose it does. I mean, it's really. Actually, it started when those woods, when I grew up as a kid behind my house, they were going to develop that, and it's developed now. It's also a housing estate. It's all gone, the whole lot. So, and that was as a young man, probably 20 years old. I think that was when that happened, around that time. So, I tried to protest against it and got nowhere, and the development happened, and there's now a housing estate. So the only way that wood survives, I suppose, is in my memory, really,
Yeah.
So that's where it lives now. So that was a big thing, and my mum was really upset about it as well. But that whole area, the sort of commuter belt around London, is all pretty much development land, isn't it? So, but I suppose I didn't do a great deal until I came to Frome, and I saw a sign up on a lamppost in the outside our Marks and Spencer's store that said application to fell. There's a beautiful plane tree in the middle of the town, and
I know the tree.
You know
yes,
it,
yeah,
and we haven't got
yeah.
a lot of trees in the town. There's not much there. So, and I saw this application to fell, and I thought, why would they want to fell this tree? It looks perfectly healthy to me. It'd be such a loss for the environment, really. So I decided to start one of those online petitions, and this was about 6-7 years ago, something. It might have been 8 years ago. It might have been 2014, I think it was. 6 years ago, 7 years ago. So I started an online petition, and they were that was the early days of them then. They weren't in such a mass as they are now. I was expecting to get maybe 100 signatures supporting me, like the old petitions I did when I was a kid. You just left it in the newsagent, people wrote their names on it,
Yeah.
So within a week, 3,000 people had signed this petition to say, don't, save the tree kind of thing. And that's 10% of our town's population. And I was blown away by that. So then got into the local press and met the council and had photo opportunities and everything. And they put a tree preservation order on the tree and preserved it. I wasn't expecting all this to happen, I just didn't know what to do, basically. And it just made me think, well, that's a little bit of people power from the ground up, because local people cared about this tree enough to do that. And it's still there now, 6-7 years later, which is, I think that's great. So that started me, because I didn't know how to approach it. You've got to go through protocols with councils, and it's no use just saying, I love this tree, leave it alone. They're not going to listen to that. Well, why, what reasoning is there, to keep this tree? And, it's a community, it's a green community asset. The landscape would be so much worse off without it. So in a small way, I started doing, campaigning for trees, and I've learned now how to try and get some protection. Win some, you lose some. You can't expect to win them all, that's for sure. But it's definitely worth doing. And at the moment, I'm seeing more impact on our trees than I've ever seen as far as development goes. So I think development is something. The building construction industry has still got the go ahead in this COVID times, and I think it's almost easier for them to do it now. So I think you've got to be vigilant, keep an eye on these things. And, it's not trying to be obstructive. It's just it's as important to keep our mature trees as it is to plant trees. The idea is, well, we'll cut these trees, but we'll plant some new ones. But you can't give the benefits of mature trees by planting little saplings. You just don't get the benefits of that.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. One of the earliest examples of deforestation that I can think of historically was during one of our wars in the Tudor period, when they used to build our battleships from was that oak?
Yeah.
There was a part of history where they always had to stop because we'd almost stripped our forests of is that correct? Am I remembering that properly?
Yeah, it had a huge impact on on our forest reserves. And the oak was, you could say that Britain was sort of founded on oak. Our houses were made of it. the ships were made of it. And in that medieval period, Britain ruled the waves. We literally did, because we had these great warships made of oak to keep that going. I mean, you need an awful lot of oak trees to make a great warship like that, So I think the first recorded planting of, the first organized planting of trees was only recorded in the 16th century, and that was Queen Elizabeth the First, who was worried that there wasn't enough oak going forward, so she basically ordered the landowners to replant with oak. One of the first replantings that was recorded on paper, because I think people have always planted oaks, because there's nothing more natural than picking up an acorn and popping it in the ground and watching it come up. I do it all the time. I've got a couple of hundred baby oaks in my back garden, which I give out to people who've got the space to replant them, to keep that perpetuity. But there's really something magical about picking up this little tiny acorn, that's good, and thinking in 500 years it could be like those giants that I've been visited. That's the idea behind it. So these trees she planted at Windsor Great Park are still there, a lot of them. 500-year-old trees, her legacy. Yeah. So this happened all over the place, and the reason she wanted to do it there was because the Forest of Dean on the Welsh border, that was where a lot of our oak came from, and she was worried that the Spanish Armada was going to come round and burn the forest down and destroy our supplies of oak, and they did actually have a plan to do that.
That was very shrewd of them.
Yeah.
Talking of legacy in the context of trees and planting trees, are you aware of that? I think it's a Greek proverb, and I might butcher the wording of it, but it's wise men plant trees that they know they'll never bask in the shade of, or something along those lines. I can't remember the exact wording of it, but there's something nice about that, isn't there? That it's you don't plant a tree selfishly.
No. Well, these oaks that I'm planting out now, I'll never get the benefits of them. I'll see them as young trees.
Yeah.
But it's that succession of planting is something that maybe we've lost a little bit. In the 18th century, when there was another drive to replant oaks in Britain for the Navy, as they started to replant, then we started to make steel ships, so they weren't needed. And a lot of those trees are still there now, but it's that planning ahead. I suppose if you don't need to plan ahead, you don't, do you? You use the resources you've got.
Yeah.
And maybe we should do it for different reasons now, rather, do it for the environment. We've got climate change and biodiversity loss. Since I was a little boy, I'm in my 50s now, and in that period, since I was a kid, we've lost half our wildlife in this country,
Wow.
And that is a huge thing to happen in my lifetime, I think,
Yeah.
So it's as big a problem as the climate change problem that we face, really.
Yeah.
And they're both linked side by side. So it's about, thinking, well, we've only got so many resources in this world, haven't we? So you've got to, think outside the box, really, and just you've got to be good to the environment, because it's our home, isn't it?
Yeah. When you said about losing the wildlife, there's a crazy statistic with the Australian bushfires. I think it was where it was projected something like 3 billion animals died or something. Is that right?
Absolutely horrendous. I don't know the figure.
It was something that was almost like you have to double take and you have to say, hang on a minute, what? How many? How many died? Crazy. But that's nature, isn't it, as well? But that is also a symptom of climate change, I guess, isn't it?
I suppose it is. I suppose so. I don't know. I say I don't know. I mean, I'm convinced that climate change is happening.
Yeah.
We know that that's happening. So yeah, but it's all linked. It's not just about that, is it? It's about our behaviour and the way we're, not treating the planet right as well, isn't it? Well, it's all off the back of us, really.
Yeah.
So we've got a responsibility to react and do something about it, haven't we? I think.
So you've been all over the world. You've been incredibly blessed to enjoy the travel that you have. And I know we've only talked about a few places that you've been. Was there anywhere else you've been that you felt was particularly impactful on you and your journey through discovering trees and educating yourself on trees? Is there other places Obviously, Japan was a big one for you. But other places that you feel were particularly sort of nourishing to you to visit?
Yeah, America was amazing. I mean, it's just doing a road trip through California, through 6 national parks, and seeing these incredible, giants of the forest, if you like, and then going and seeing that 12,000 foot up in the mountains, looking at these little bristlecone pines. I mean, is so humbling, and it just makes you realize how small you are,
Yeah.
in the scheme of things. 2 different mountain ranges, completely different trees on each one. But within, you can see one range from the other, it's really, as the crow flies, it's pretty close. So I think New Zealand, America, California in particular, and Japan really stand out as highlights. But even going to Europe, everything's a learning curve, and you go to Denmark and northern France and Germany, and the treescape's pretty similar to Britain. So we're in the same we're in the same hemisphere, in the same area. But then as you travel south, the treescape changes, and you get to the Mediterranean, and the old ancient trees you start to see olives, these ancient olive trees, which have all around the Mediterranean, which have given the people a living for thousands of years. And there's that beneficial symbiotic relationship again, So the trees have provided olives to feed the people, and in return, the people keep the trees going,
Yeah.
So you can, in Sardinia, you go and you see the oaks there, which are different to ours. They're cork oaks. So the bark is cork. That's where cork comes from, is the bark of a cork oak tree. And I mean, you strip the bark from a cork oak tree, and then they make corks from it. And if you do that to any other tree, they'll die, because if you ring bark a tree, it can't feed itself. So,
right.
But for cork oaks, they can survive. So every 8 to 10 years, they strip the bark only up to the branches. So you see like this bald tree with bark all on the branches, and that's been a relationship between people and trees since Roman times. The Roman army marched on cork, on their sandals. So they've been harvesting that cork for all that time. But very recently, really, in the scheme of things, we now have screw-top bottles. I mean, I go into the co-op and I can't find a bottle with a cork in it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's impacted on the environment because they're not needed anymore. So if it doesn't give a living to the people, they can't support that environment. And it's really had a big impact on those cork oak forests, which, give the biodiversity to all sorts of animals that live in them,
Yeah.
So that's why you should always buy champagne or Prosecco, because it's got a cork in it.
Because,
or Rioja.
Right, because if they don't need those trees any longer, they're more inclined to cut them down and build something where they can work.
Yeah,
right.
And it's interesting that for thousands of years it's provided a living, but very recently, I mean, in our time, it's that changeover has happened, and had a huge impact on that.
Talking of our time, what
Yeah.
do you expect to see happen in our time? That is a very broad question, I appreciate, but is there somewhere we're heading we should reverse that will happen in our lifetime if we're not proactive about it?
I mean, I don't know, Andy. That's a really difficult question to answer. But I view it in a sort of Brexit way, if you like. I think it's like a 50-50 mentality on nature and the environment. Maybe, I don't know if that's a good balance, an accurate balance. But I think half the people are into it and want to support it, and maybe the other half aren't really that interested. So you can't write those people off. You've got to try and explain the benefits and maybe a bit of education, without trying to sound
patronising.
Yeah, without trying to sound patronising, really. So, I mean, I feel I know a lot of people who've had big impacts on tree planting. There's plant 1 million trees. There's a group called the Tree Sisters, and they wanted to plant 1 million trees. That was their aim, to combat climate change. So, and obviously they were in the UK, I think, in America, and they looked at trying to plant, and they decided, well, it doesn't matter where we do it, because you're still providing the same amount of oxygen to the world wherever you plant these trees, and CO2 absorption. So they ended up doing it in India,
right,
because it was cheaper and easier for them to do that. And they have planted 1 million trees out there, And I think that's brilliant that they've done that. But that wouldn't be my approach. I look at the local aspect, which is maybe a small-minded approach, but I just think I can have more impact to my local environment where I live, really,
Yeah.
that I know. And and especially being in Britain, that figure about losing all our wildlife, maybe in Britain, that's where I'd really like my impact to be. I think you can spread yourself very thinly. So I try to be a little bit more direct in what I do.
Yeah.
Because you can only do so much as one person can.
Yeah, you can. Okay, good place to wrap this up, I think. Are you working on any new books at the moment?
I am, actually, yes. I can't say too much about it because I'm sworn to secrecy, but it's another tree book, I can tell you that. And it's working with other people this time.
Nice.
So there'll be 5 of us involved, and I'm really excited about it. As soon as I can, I'll let on about that.
Big thank you to this week's guest, Julian Hight. If you want to read his books and generally find out what he's up to, we will leave all relevant links to those in the show notes descriptions. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you can. If you've got a friend that really loves trees, got any tree-hugging friends, then make sure you send them this podcast and see if they enjoy it. You can follow us on social media. The handle is @TheGiantPod. That is the same for Twitter as it is Instagram, and you can get me on Instagram at Andy_S1S. This podcast was produced by Harry the Maple Williams. That was lame. We will see you next week on The Giant Pod. Thanks very much.